A cardboard box hit the ground and split open. Dozens of small yellow bodies spilled across the gravel, peeping and shaking. Another box landed on top of the first. Then another. Boxes kept coming off the truck, stacking up like garbage nobody wanted. Some of the chicks weren't moving at all. A truck door slammed. An engine started before anyone could stop it. Tires kicked up dust and gravel, spraying over the shaking pile of birds. Nobody from the hatchery looked back. 400 chicks, dumped behind a barn, left to die in the cold. That's when a pair of small hands reached into the pile. 13-year-old Mia Turner knelt down in the dirt and started counting survivors. Why would a hatchery throw away 400 living chicks instead of selling them? Stick around, because what this kid did next changed everything. Mia's knees were soaked through from the dirt, but she didn't stop moving. 289. That's what she counted when she finally stopped shaking long enough to get a real number. 289 chicks still breathing out of 400 dumped in the gravel behind the barn. The rest were already gone, stiff and quiet, and she made herself look away from those so she could focus on the ones she could still save. She didn't call for her parents. Not yet. There wasn't time. She ran to the equipment shed and grabbed the old wheelbarrow, the one with the flat tire her dad kept meaning to fix. She threw in an armful of straw from the loft, then went back for more. Her arms were small for this kind of work, but she'd been doing farm chores since she could walk, and right now that mattered more than her size. The chicks were too many to carry all at once. So she pulled the bottom of her sweatshirt into a makeshift pouch and started scooping them in, 6 or 7 at a time, cradling the fabric against her stomach as she half ran toward the old barn on the far side of the property. It was the barn nobody used anymore, the one with the busted door hinge and the leaky roof over the west stall. But it was dry enough, and it was close enough, and right now that was all that mattered. Trip after trip. Her sweatshirt getting damp. Her arms aching. The peeping sound never stopped, weak and scattered, chicks calling out for warmth they didn't have. By the time she'd made it through most of the pile, the sun was still barely up. Her parents were still inside the house. Nobody had come out to check the noise from the driveway, because on the Turner farm, trucks pulling up and pulling away wasn't unusual. Feed deliveries. Equipment repairs. People coming to look at the tractor they'd had listed for sale for 2 months now with no bites. The farm wasn't failing exactly. But it wasn't far from it either. Her dad worked a second job at the hardware store in town 3 days a week just to keep the property taxes paid. Her mom did the books for a trucking company out of a spare bedroom that used to be Mia's playroom. The animals on the farm, the 2 goats, the old mule, the dozen sheep, none of them made money. They cost money. The only thing on the whole property that actually turned a profit, even a small one, was Mia's flock. She kept 18 hens in a coop she'd built herself 2 summers ago, mostly out of scrap wood and chicken wire her dad didn't need anymore. Every Saturday she loaded egg cartons into a red wagon and pulled it 3 blocks to the farmer's market in town, where she sold them for $4 a dozen. It wasn't much. But it was hers. She'd bought the wire, the feed, even a new roost pole with that money, and what was left over went into a coffee can in her closet that she wasn't supposed to talk about at school because kids made fun of stuff like that. She knew what it meant to raise something from nothing. She knew what it meant to watch something grow because you fed it and kept it warm and didn't give up on it, even on the days it would have been easier to. That's why she couldn't leave those chicks in the gravel. By late morning she had all 289 crowded into the west stall of the old barn, huddled together in the straw, some stronger than others, some barely lifting their heads. She found an old heat lamp in the shed, one her dad had used years back for a batch of piglets that didn't survive their first winter. The bulb was cracked, but it still worked. She rigged it up with a spare extension cord that ran all the way from the outlet by the tractor, taping the cord along the stall wall so nobody would trip on it. She sat on an overturned bucket and watched the chicks settle under the light, some of them finally starting to move around instead of just shivering in place. That first night, she lost 6 more. She found them in the morning, tucked in the corner where the heat didn't quite reach. She didn't cry. She just moved the heat lamp closer, fixed the gap in the straw, and made herself a promise standing right there in the barn doorway with the cold morning air on her face. Whatever it cost her, she was keeping every single one of those chicks alive. Morning light was stronger now, and Mia went back out to the driveway where the boxes still sat, flattened and empty, waiting to be thrown away. That's when she saw it. Taped to the side of one busted box was a piece of paper, torn at the corner, half stuck to the cardboard with packing tape gone yellow in the sun. She peeled it off and read it twice before it made sense. 400 units. Grade B non-viable for retail. It was an invoice. A hatchery invoice, the kind that got stapled to a shipping manifest somewhere in an office 2 counties over. Somebody had written these chicks off before the truck ever left the lot. On paper, all 400 of them were already trash. Not almost trash. Already trash. Somebody had done the math and decided it was cheaper to dump them behind a stranger's barn than to feed them another week. Mia folded the invoice and put it in her back pocket. She didn't know yet what it was worth. She just knew it felt like proof of something. That's when her dad came out onto the porch, coffee in hand, squinting at the mess of straw and empty boxes in the driveway. It took him about 4 seconds to understand what he was looking at, and about 4 more to see his daughter standing there covered in dirt and dried mud, looking like she hadn't slept. He didn't yell. He just asked her how many made it. 283, she told him. After last night. Her dad walked to the barn with her and looked into the west stall. Rows of yellow bodies packed together under the cracked heat lamp, peeping, moving, alive. He stood there a long moment. Then he told her to keep going and he'd figure out the rest. By that afternoon, word was already loose in town. Somebody, nobody ever figured out exactly who, had driven past that morning, seen the boxes and the gravel and the mess, and snapped a photo before the Turners even had a chance to clean it up. That photo went online with the hatchery's name tagged right in the caption. By evening it had been shared past the county line. By the next morning, it had a life of its own. Comments piled up under it. People angry. People asking questions. People tagging the hatchery's page directly, demanding answers nobody there seemed in a hurry to give. 2 days later, a car Mia didn't recognize pulled into the driveway. A man got out in a collared shirt with the hatchery's logo stitched over the pocket. He introduced himself as being sent to, in his words, collect their property. Mia was standing right there when he said it. Her mouth went dry, but she didn't move. The man explained, calm and flat, like he'd said the same line a dozen times already, that the chicks were still legally the hatchery's, regardless of where they'd ended up. Company property, he called them. Even the dead ones on the invoice. Even the ones breathing right now under a heat lamp in somebody else's barn. That's when her dad stepped out from the porch. He didn't raise his voice either. He just asked the man one question. If those chicks were still the hatchery's property, why were they dumped in gravel and left to die instead of being driven back to wherever they came from? The man didn't have an answer for that. Not one that held up, anyway. Mia found her voice then, standing next to her father, arms crossed the same way his were. She told the man plainly that she wasn't handing over a single bird. Not after what it took to keep them alive. Not after 2 nights of barely sleeping to check on them. The man left without the chicks. On his way out he said the hatchery's lawyer would be in touch, and that this wasn't over. For a 13-year-old, that kind of sentence could have been terrifying. And it was, a little. But standing there next to her father, watching the man's car pull away, it also felt like the first time in this whole mess that somebody with power had backed down, even for a moment. The story kept moving after that. A local news station called, then showed up with a camera crew, filming the barn, filming the stall, filming Mia scooping feed into small trays while 200 and some chicks scrambled over each other to get to it. The segment ran that night. By the next morning, a feed store 2 towns over had called the house directly, offering to donate bags of chick starter for as long as she needed it. No charge. Just a small act of decency from strangers who'd seen the story and wanted to help. The receipt for that first donated shipment came stapled to a delivery slip, dropped off with 50 pounds of feed stacked at the barn door. Mia kept it, same as she kept the invoice, though she couldn't have said exactly why yet. By the end of that week, the barn had settled into something like a rhythm. Feeding times ran smooth, morning and evening. The heat lamp stayed steady. The stronger chicks were eating well, growing feathers along their wings, moving around the straw with real energy instead of just huddling in place. 260 of them had made it through, strong and steady under that light. Mia sat down on the same overturned bucket she'd used that first cold morning, elbows on her knees, watching all those small yellow bodies peep and scratch and shuffle around each other like nothing in the world had ever tried to kill them. For the first time since the truck doors slammed shut that morning, she let herself believe the worst part was over. She smiled, just a little, and for a moment, sitting there in the quiet hum of the heat lamp, it felt like it really was. The quiet didn't last long. 4 days later, a certified letter showed up in the Turner's mailbox, the kind that needed a signature just to accept it. Mia's mother signed for it on the porch, and Mia watched her face change as she read it standing right there in the doorway. The hatchery was filing a claim against the family, demanding the chicks be returned, or full market payment for what the letter called stolen livestock. 260 birds. Priced out at market rate, the number at the bottom of that letter was enough to make her father go quiet for a long time at the kitchen table that night. This wasn't about a barn full of chicks anymore. It wasn't about heat lamps or feed schedules or who showed up at the driveway asking for property back. It was about money now. Real money, the kind the Turner farm didn't have sitting around, the kind that could put a lien on the land itself if it went the wrong way. Mia sat at that kitchen table too, even though nobody had asked her to. Her dad slid the letter across so she could read it herself. Full market payment or return of the birds. Company letterhead. A case number already assigned. She read it twice, same as she'd read the invoice folded up in her back pocket that first morning. Her stomach turned in a different way this time. Not fear for the chicks. Fear for the house, the barn, the tractor still sitting in the yard with a for sale sign nobody had called about. Her dad rubbed his face and said the word lawyer out loud for the first time, and it landed heavy in the room. They didn't have one. Not the kind who handled things like this anyway. For a few days, that letter sat on the kitchen counter like something none of them wanted to touch again. Mia kept doing chores. Feeding times. Water changes. Checking the heat lamp twice a day. But every time she walked past that counter, her stomach dropped a little. Then the local reporter who'd covered the first story called again. Only this time she wasn't asking about chicks in a barn. She was asking questions that went a lot further back. She'd pulled old public records, shipping manifests, county complaint filings going back almost 6 years. And what she found wasn't one bad morning at one hatchery. It was a pattern. Other farms nearby, 3 of them at least, had gotten the same kind of delivery over the years. Boxes of chicks marked non-viable, dumped quietly on back acreage where nobody would notice for a day or two. No news coverage back then. No photo online. Just quiet losses that got written off and forgotten, farm after farm, year after year. The hatchery hadn't made one mistake. It had been doing this on purpose, culling the numbers that didn't sell instead of paying to keep them fed, and dumping the evidence somewhere it figured nobody would ask questions. Mia sat with that information a long time after the reporter hung up. 289 chicks in her barn weren't an accident. They were a cost of doing business. A line item somebody had decided was cheaper to throw away than to fix. That's when something in this whole thing shifted for her. It wasn't just about saving birds anymore. It was about making sure nobody could pretend this hadn't happened. News of the pattern went out fast, same as the first photo had. And this time the town didn't just get angry online. People showed up in person. Neighbors dropped off bags of feed at the barn door without being asked. A woman from 2 farms over brought a spare heat lamp in case Mia's old cracked one finally gave out. Somebody started a fund at the local bank, just a coffee can on the counter at first, then a real account within a week, money coming in from people the Turners had never even met. For a family that had been counting every dollar for years, watching a town rally behind them like that meant something none of them had words for right away. If you're still with me, this is the part where you'd think the worst was behind them. Hit that subscribe button, because what happens next is the part that changes everything for this family, and you don't want to miss where this goes. Because 2 days after that fun started, a car pulled up outside Mia's school during dismissal. It wasn't the same man from the driveway. This one wore a suit, carried a briefcase, and asked the front office directly for Mia Turner by name. She was called down to the office over the intercom, her stomach dropping the second she heard her name mixed in with a stranger's voice out front. The lawyer introduced himself calm and polished, the way people talk when they've done this 100 times before. He said he just wanted to speak with her family informally. Get ahead of things before the hearing. Mia's mom got there within 10 minutes, practically running from the parking lot, and the office staff had already told the man to wait outside rather than speak to a 13-year-old without a parent present. But the fact that he'd shown up there at all, at her school, in front of her classmates and teachers, said everything about how far the hatchery was willing to go. That night at the kitchen table, her dad set his phone down after a long call with someone from the town council who'd offered to help find them real legal counsel, pro bono, given everything that had come out that week. He looked at Mia and told her straight. This was heading to a hearing. And if it went that far, she might have to stand up in front of people and explain everything herself. Mia thought about the invoice still folded in her drawer. 400 units. Grade B non-viable for retail. She thought about 260 birds peeping under a heat lamp in her barn right now, alive because she hadn't looked away. She told her dad she wasn't scared of that. Not anymore. The hearing was set for a Thursday morning at the county building downtown, in a room usually reserved for zoning disputes and parking ticket appeals. Nobody expected it to fill up the way it did. By 8:30, folding chairs were dragged in from a storage closet because the regular seating ran out. Farmers, neighbors, people from 3 counties over who'd read the story online and driven in just to watch. The reporter sat near the front with a notepad already half filled. Mia sat between her parents at a table meant for 2, her hands folded on top of the invoice she'd carried in a plastic sleeve since the morning it all started. Across the aisle sat the Hatchery's lawyer, the same man from the school parking lot, briefcase open, papers stacked and squared like he'd done this 100 times and expected today to be no different. The judge came in, and the room went quiet fast. The Hatchery's case started simple enough. Their lawyer stood and laid it out plain. 260 birds, market value calculated per head, a demand for payment or return of what he called company property, regardless of the circumstances they'd been found in. He used the word circumstances a lot. Like it was a technicality. Like gravel and cold mornings and dead chicks stiff in a pile were just circumstances. Then it was Mia's turn. Her lawyer, a woman the town council had found for her 2 weeks earlier, could have handled the questioning herself. But when the judge asked if the family had anything to present, Mia stood up before anyone else could. 13 years old, in a barn jacket she hadn't bothered to change out of, she walked to the small table set up in front of the judge's bench and laid the invoice down flat so the whole room could see it if they leaned forward enough. 400 units. Grade B non-viable for retail. She said the hatchery wrote off 400 living chicks on paper the same morning they dumped them in gravel behind her family's barn. She said 289 of them were still breathing when she got to them. She said she counted every single one herself, on her knees, before her parents even knew what had happened. Then she said the number that mattered most. 260 of those chicks were alive right now, this morning, healthy, growing feathers, eating out of her hand twice a day. Not because the hatchery had done anything to save them. Because she had. She looked at the lawyer directly and asked him how a company could call something company property in one sentence, and non-viable trash in the next, when it was the exact same batch of birds, marked on the exact same piece of paper, on the exact same day. The room went still in a way that felt different from before. That's when her lawyer stepped in with the second piece of evidence, the one that had come in only 4 days earlier from a source the hatchery clearly hadn't expected to surface. A former employee, someone who'd worked the culling floor for going on 5 years, had reached out to the reporter after seeing the story spread online. He'd handed over an internal memo, dated back 3 years, laying out culling quotas by month. Grade B stock. Non-viable units. The same language, over and over, spreadsheet after spreadsheet, showing this wasn't one bad morning at one hatchery. It was routine. Years of it. The lawyer read part of it out loud into the record, his voice steady even as murmurs rolled through the folding chairs behind him. The hatchery's lawyer tried to argue the memo was unrelated, that it didn't apply to this specific claim, that the only thing before the court was the matter of the 260 birds currently in the Turner family's possession. But the judge had already stopped looking at his notes. He was looking at the invoice still sitting flat on the table, and then at the memo pages spread beside it, and the math wasn't hard to follow anymore. A company that graded a batch of birds as worthless trash on paper, the same day it dumped them to die, had no standing to turn around weeks later and call those same birds valuable property worth full market payment. You can't write something off as garbage and then sue somebody for stealing the garbage. The judge said almost exactly that, in more careful words, but the meaning landed the same way in every corner of that room. There was a pause, a long one, while he flipped back through the invoice one more time, then set it down. He dismissed the claim. No payment owed. No birds returned. And on the record, entered permanently into the county file, the hatchery's own paperwork stood as proof of exactly what they'd done, not just to the Turner family, but to every other farm the reporter had traced back over 6 years of quiet dumping. The room didn't erupt exactly, this wasn't a movie, but there was a release in it. Chairs creaking as people leaned back. A few claps that started slow and grew before someone reminded everyone this was still a courtroom. Mia's mother had a hand pressed over her mouth. Her father just sat there for a second, staring at the table like he wasn't sure it was really over. Mia stayed standing a moment longer than she needed to, looking at the invoice one more time before she folded it back into its plastic sleeve. Outside, on the courthouse steps, the reporter asked her how it felt. Mia didn't have some big speech ready. She just said 260 birds were alive because somebody decided to check the pile before walking away from it. And that from now on, maybe the hatchery would have to think twice before writing anyone off as trash again. Within a week, the county's dismissal was public record, and so was the memo. State regulators didn't take long to open their own file. 6 months later, the Turner barn didn't look like the same building. The busted door hinge had been fixed. The leaky roof over the west stall was patched clean. Somebody from town had donated the lumber, and Mia's dad had spent 2 weekends putting it right, saying the barn had earned that much at least. Inside, 260 hens filled the space that once held shivering chicks under a cracked heat lamp. They were grown now, feathered out, loud in the mornings the way healthy hens get. Mia still did the feeding herself, same as always, though these days she had a system. Trays timed out. Water lines that didn't freeze. A logbook she kept in a drawer, tracking who was laying and who wasn't, same careful counting she'd done that first cold morning in the gravel. The egg business had grown past anything her red wagon could carry. Families from 3 counties overplaced orders now, some driving out just to see the barn they'd read about online. A few of them bought started pullets straight from Mia, birds she'd raised herself from the original 289. She kept a waiting list taped inside the barn door, names and phone numbers in her own handwriting. The coffee can in her closet had turned into a real account at the same bank that once passed around a fun jar for her family. Her mom helped her with the numbers some nights at the kitchen table, the same table where that certified letter had once sat like something nobody wanted to touch. The hatchery wasn't doing so well. The state investigation that followed the hearing moved faster than anyone expected, helped along by the memo and by 4 other farms that came forward once they saw the Turners hadn't been punished for speaking up. Inspectors found violations going back years. Records that didn't match. Culling numbers that never should have existed on paper in the first place. Within 4 months, the hatchery lost its license to sell to any of the major retail buyers that had kept it running. What was left of the business scaled down to almost nothing, a fraction of what it used to be, and the name that once meant something in 3 counties now meant the opposite. Mia didn't think about them much anymore. She didn't need to. What she thought about, most days, standing in the barn doorway with a feed bucket in each hand, was how close those 289 chicks had come to just being another line on somebody's spreadsheet. Grade B non-viable. Written off before they ever hit the gravel. The torn invoice hung on the barn wall now, pinned behind a small square of glass her dad had put up so it wouldn't fall apart any further. Right next to it, the feed store receipt from that first donated shipment. Small reminders, the both of them, of exactly where all of this had started, and how little it had taken, in the beginning, for one person to decide those birds were worth something. Word had spread past eggs and pullets by then too. Farmers who'd culled a weak lamb or couldn't keep a limping goat started calling the Turner place directly, asking if Mia would take them in. She never said no. There was a 3-legged goat in the front pasture now, and a rooster nobody else wanted because he didn't crow right, and a pair of geese some family couldn't keep anymore when they moved into town. The farm that once barely broke even was still not exactly rich. But it had a purpose now that it hadn't had before, and that mattered more to the Turners than the numbers ever had. On a cool morning in early fall, a truck slowed down outside the gate, different from the one that had come through all those months back. This one didn't speed off in a cloud of dust. It idled there a moment, then a man got out, walked a small box up to the fence line, and set it down gently in the grass. He knocked on the gate post, waited until Mia came out onto the porch, and told her there were 4 chicks inside, hatched wrong somehow, legs turned in a way that meant nobody at his place would buy them. He asked, plain and a little embarrassed, if she'd be willing to take them. Mia walked down and knelt by the box the same way she had that first cold morning, lifting the flaps back slow. 4 small yellow bodies blinked up at her, weak but breathing, peeping soft in the morning air. She looked up at the man and told him she would. He thanked her, got back in his truck, and drove off at a normal speed, no dust kicked up behind him, no boxes thrown from a moving vehicle onto the gravel. Mia carried the box toward the barn the way she'd carried them the first time, cradled against her, careful with every step. Inside, under a heat lamp that never went dark anymore, 260 hens shifted and clucked their way toward the sound of her boots on the straw. She set the new box down gently in the corner, checked the bulb, and adjusted the lamp a few inches lower. Then she sat down on the same overturned bucket she'd used from the very beginning, and watched 4 more small lives start figuring out how to be warm,